Care Talk with Laura Packard is a podcast covering healthcare in America from a progressive perspective. Our healthcare system is broken, and we all know insurance companies are out of control. If you don't have health insurance or don't understand the differences between insurance plans, or have surprise medical bills, out of control prescription drug costs, or can't get the care you need, listen to Care Talk with Laura Packard weekly on Tuesdays. What's going to happen to your healthcare under the Trump administration? From prescription drug prices to health insurance costs, from healthcare for seniors and people with disabilities to reproductive care, from care for veterans to public health, including vaccinations. Healthcare experts answer your questions every week, and they go in-depth on Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, private insurance, and more. Go to healthcarevoices.org/caretalk or search for Care Talk with Laura Packard on your favorite podcast app to listen today.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hi, Truth Seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of the UnSpun Journal Club. You know, we've talked on the pod before about the threat that AI can pose to quality information because it can create information really quickly and for very little money. And so that makes it very easy to flood the zone with fakes. But, you know, AI might have other potential in combating that same fake information. And that's the subject of this week's paper. Let's get unspun. The paper's called, "Do Communication Managers Trust AI Fact-Checking? An Examination of Ethical Decision-Making, Credibility, and Fact-Checking Behavior." And it's by Daniel Hunt, along with colleagues at the University of Rhode Island and Simmons in Boston. And I thought it was interesting because it relates to some of the ideas of human in the loop. So this is a concept with AI where people will encourage organizations to develop processes that don't just let AI do the job. Instead, there has to be a person somewhere that's checking up on the AI's work. And, you know, it's turned out that this is kind of a problem. I've seen a lot of articles lately in the news about rough patches that companies are having when they're adding AI into their workflows. I think we all know that AI does make mistakes. It hallucinates, sometimes it's just biased in its responses. And when it makes those mistakes, it may need a human to catch it. Now, this can become a problem for a couple of reasons. I saw some really interesting work lately about the concept of work slop. I'm sure you've heard of AI slop, right? The easy to make but mid-quality work that can be produced with AI tools. But this article suggested that work slop has some real costs for organizations too, because it talked about what you could call knowledge decay. This is where the AI does the job and people forget how to do it. Now, I think this is pretty interesting. It's not just the fact that work products can be poor, but the workforce itself may get worse at doing tasks. In my world, in journalism and communications, one important task is verifying information. There's some good reasons for that, right? Because studies show that having incorrect information really reduces credibility for the audience. If the news is wrong, sometimes people just stop trusting the news. And it's the same with messages that come through advertising or public relations or social media or wherever it is that you get information. But at the same time, organizations are facing a lot of pressure to keep communicating and to do it quickly. Search engines, for example, reward fresh information. If you're updating your web page, you're more likely to show up high in search. And all of us in the audience, we are now pretty used to 24-hour continuous feed of information. But at the same time, there's been a collapse of the funding model for media, which we've talked about on UnSpun a bunch of times. And this has meant that there are fewer people left to create that information. Fact checking is an essential, so important, but also a very laborious process. It takes a lot of time to verify the things that people say. Someone can throw off lies a mile a minute and it will take hours to, check those. So what if we could get a machine to do it for us? Well, it turns out that you can. There are tools that do that, but there are pros and cons. The tools exist and they don't get tired and they don't need to take vacations, and that all sounds awesome, right? And there can even be some other advantages. So, for example, when you label something as an AI fact check, in some cases the audience assumes that the information actually is less biased. But there are also weaknesses. There's a real concern that AI doesn't have the nuance of judgment that a human does. And it seems like AI verification works better with some kinds of stories than it does with others. Even if it works great, there's also a concern about whether your audience will like it. Because, for some people, even a suggestion, just a hint of AI use hurts credibility. So one way around this is to include that human in the loop, which means that somewhere the work that's being done by a Gen AI gets verified by a human with expert knowledge. The whole idea of human in the loop assumes that humans have an important role that machines can't do. And I think in a lot of cases, this has been considered for ethical matters, right? You can have more ethical work if a human's checking to make sure that it's ethical. But it also matters for nuance and for correctness. I did a blog post for work about the fact that AI can feel very truthy. Stephen Colbert introduced that idea to us as something that feels true, so you assume that it must be true. So for example, if a student of mine has AI produce a news story that looks kind of like the story I'm asking them to write, it has quotes and it has the structure and language of a news story, it might be easy for my student to assume that the story was good or appropriate. But actually it's truthy. It looks like it's good or appropriate, but the actual content could be extremely wrong. For example, it will make up quotes for you. So what I think is more of a risk, especially for companies, is that the actual content might be just slightly wrong. And sometimes those slightly wrong things can really matter. This is true beyond just writing. So for example, Ford Motor Company used AI-powered factory cameras to look at their production lines and determine when parts had flaws so it could pull them and not put them in cars. Well, it turned out that the AI systems did a not great job. It wasn't a massively bad job, but they did miss subtle little things that were going to cause problems. And when they did that, it led to lots of issues with the actual cars that they built. Ford has led all US automakers in recalls, and the company has had to pay out huge amounts of money in warranty claims. So the AI was not very good at that subtlety, and Ford actually had to rehire a bunch of veteran engineers. And it turns out that it's more than just the work, it's also the companies themselves. The humans in the loop have to actually be in the loop, and that has caused some problems. I know in my world, when my students use AI to write, it is often less fun for me to read because the things that it produces tend to be very generic. But more than that, it is my job to provide feedback on work that's submitted to me, so I do it. But it is a little bit demoralizing for me to spend a lot of time providing feedback to a human for work that the human did not do. You will see this in workplaces as well. You'll sometimes find a little bit of an AI hangover. The employees who are forced into being that human in the loop, they resent the products that they're being asked to work with, and so sometimes they do a bad job. And that is kind of the idea of this episode's paper. How good of a job are people expecting AI to do? How much do they trust those tools? Now, the authors note quite correctly that there are really big costs in communications if an organization distributes bad information. And at the same time, there's been kind of an ongoing ethical question in the field about whether it's a good idea to use AI, and if so, how can you use it? Publishers have been kind of bullish on it, I think with the idea that they can reduce their cost for staff. Some studies of audiences have found that audiences don't mind some types of AI use. So for example, you can use an AI tool to look at a large public data set and to help with the analysis, and that could help you bring out things that are really of interest to your audience and to the public. And if that AI use is disclosed, so if the journalist explains how they did it, studies have shown that audiences don't really mind that. But the job of determining if AI use is ethical and helpful usually falls on frontline managers who have to interpret the wishes of those top managers, the top brass, the publishers, for the writers, video producers, other people who work for them. Or in other words, It is up to the managers to ensure that their organization is making a responsible use of AI. And I have to tell you, they don't always do a great job of this. Here is an example where Starbucks Korea learned this the hard way. The company had announced a special Tank Day promotion that was set to launch on May 18th. Well, it turns out that that date, May 18th, for Koreans, commemorates a historical event when the former government, which was a military dictatorship, deployed troops and tanks into pro-democracy protests, and hundreds of civilians either died or were injured. And there were other hidden meanings as well. But this is the kind of thing a major brand should know better. They shouldn't have a Tank Day promotion on a day when people are sensitive about tanks being deployed against the public, even though they were talking about, like a big tanker of coffee. The public reacted badly, and people were posting videos of themselves destroying Starbucks products and protesting outside stores. So who could come up with such an ill-advised campaign? It was an AI tool, and there was a human in the loop. The campaign was supposed to be approved by managers, but they did a later investigation, the company, and they found that those managers didn't even open the email attachments that they were supposed to review. So, although managers might be expected to be the human in the loop, it doesn't always work out that way. So in this paper, managers weren't fact-checking AI, but they were using AI as a fact checker. And one of the first questions the author answers is, how do managers decide what to do? And they state that managers will make changes when they feel that employees are prepared for it. They sometimes get guidance from professional associations, and sometimes they're just making judgments about the risk versus benefit. So having said that, they surveyed more than 300 communication managers, asking them questions about the risks and benefits of using AI at work to verify information. And they generally found that when people know more about the ethics of using AI, they're more likely to see the tools as ethically risky. But there's also this factor of perceived risk, and that can lead to anxiety, and anxiety means you're more likely to use those fact-checking tools. So let's break this down. So the study confirmed that if you are more aware of the ethical risks of AI, right, it might be wrong, your audience might be able to tell and not like you, those kinds of things, you tend to feel more anxious about it. And kind of surprisingly, this anxiety actually increases the chances that you're going to use fact-checking tools. This is both AI-powered ones and traditional fact-checking websites, because it seems like that anxiety creates a motivation to double-check the information. The study also asked about if you believed a source was credible, and if so, if that affected how anxiety changes your behavior. For AI-powered tools, credibility didn't change the relationship between anxiety and usage. If you're anxious, you're more likely to use AI tools regardless of how much you trust them. For traditional fact-checking websites, credibility did matter. If you're anxious, but you don't trust traditional fact-checking websites, you're more likely to use them to verify things. But if you already believe that fact-checking websites are really credible, your anxiety is not going to drive you to use them as much, perhaps because you already trust them enough to rely on them without the extra anxiety-driven push. People who are worried about the ethics of AI aren't just sitting around being nervous, they're acting. And when they feel anxious about AI, they tend to go out and actually use AI to verify the information more often. But how they verify it depends on what they trust. If they're anxious but don't fully trust fact-checking websites, they're more likely to use those sites to confirm the truth. And I think this has a couple of interesting takeaways. So let me ask you, truth seekers, who should decide when AI use is acceptable? People have really different perspectives on this, and I don't know where you are on things. You may think AI is getting forced on you. For example, it's hard to do a search that isn't AI assisted. So in that case, it's maybe the tech companies who are deciding that you have to use it. You may also feel like AI is not available to you. So better models do cost money, and some people get that subsidized. So for example, college students have gotten access to pretty good models for free, really since the beginning of generative AI being available to the public. Now, this is a strategy from those tech companies because they're trying to make future personnel at businesses dependent on their tools so that those businesses will pay for them. But for you and me, even right now, we're not students, and the better quality models are going to cost us money. And that's also a decision from tech companies. So what does this mean for the owners of those organizations? There's some strong evidence that there's been a kind of a FOMO, right? A fear of missing out on the part of really high-level folks in a lot of organizations, because generative AI could be this transformative thing, right? And if you don't jump in with both feet, you missed out and it's the end of your organization. But there's also this thing called the Gartner hype cycle that says that new technologies go through a series of steps in the market as they become integrated into work. Here's how it works. There's a new thing, new and exciting thing, like generative AI. And you hit a peak of inflated expectations, right? This is before you try it. You think, oh, it's going to be great. It's going to be really important. I need to try it. And then you try it and you hit what they call the trough of disillusionment. You then step back and try to figure out what's actually true, and you climb up the slope of enlightenment before you get to the plateau of productivity. And in a lot of industries, executives were, for whatever reason, very full speed ahead on AI. And we know this from media interviews. We know this from flashy social media posts and press releases. And in a kind of a sadder way, we also know it because a lot of people got fired as they got displaced by AI. This is a really interesting thing, though. Researchers have done studies of these organizations, and they found that even though top executives are very interested in AI, often frontline employees don't use the tools. And this is probably for a variety of reasons, but I think an important one is that sometimes a Gen AI tool just makes it harder to do your job because you have to check up on everything it did. And that's a different kind of work, but it's still work. So the question is, how can it be that the top folks want it, but it doesn't actually happen? This is because the middle managers, the ones who are in this survey and the ones who supervise the frontline employees, aren't forcing the issue. So that's where this paper comes in. These middle managers are being driven by their anxiety to use tools that might make the information that you get more truthy and less accurate. And that's probably worth knowing. Okay, truth seekers, thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the UnSpun Journal Club. Stay sharp, everyone. Thanks for getting UnSpun with me this week. UnSpun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.
It's Sunday morning, and that wonderfully relaxed feeling of a long, lazy day lingers in the air. If you want to make the moment last, may I suggest the perfect solution: the Martin Sheen Podcast. Join me, your host Martin Sheen, for beautifully crafted 20-minute programs filled with never-before-heard stories of my life, along with personal reflections and poetry that inspires. The Martin Sheen Podcast is the perfect Sunday refresh, a chance to take a deep breath, relax, and know that the stress of Monday may be just around the corner, but not here, not now. So make this your weekly moment of calm as we explore faith, hope, love, and what it means to be human. And know this journey is ever unfolding as I invite you to see what's next with me, Martin Sheen. And thank you.